Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. We're going to go ahead and give people about a minute or so to hop on before we get started. So feel free to use the restroom, grab some water, do what you need to do before we get going. All right. So thank you again for joining us this morning for the final peer support conference of the year here with Empower Idaho. Please do write down the emails that are displayed on the screen right now so you have access to contact our staff should you have any tech issues. My name is Alejandra Del Toro, and I am the Education and Community Coordinator with Empower Idaho. Empower Idaho is a program that offers provider trainings, advocacy, and education for adults with behavioral health conditions in Idaho. Today we are here with Michelle Batten on the topic of using your story to promote change. Before we officially begin, I want to share a little bit about the control panel so you have a sense of how to connect with our team. So, for all of your comments and questions, you will access the questions drop-down box in the control panel. Again, that is for comments and questions, and we will be reviewing them throughout the presentation and addressing them as we can, and we will also have some time at the end to answer your questions. You do have access to the slides, and those are located under the Handouts tab. You are able to download those and follow along throughout the presentation if you'd like. We are also recording this session, so know that that will be available on the Empower Idaho website within the next couple of business days. So lastly, for the CEU eligibility, please do refer to your confirmation and reminder emails where we have detailed what items you need to complete in order for you to be eligible for those CEUs. I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Michelle. Thank you all again for joining us.
Good morning. I'm excited to be here. I work at Families and Youth of Idaho. Some of you may have known us prior as Idaho Federation of Families for Children's Mental Health. We're a family-run organization that focuses on supporting youth with mental health and their families. So my name is, I'm the Family Engagement Director, and I enjoy my job of supporting parents and getting to supervise our youth programs. It's an exciting opportunity to statewide give that support and education. And lately, we have been able to speak to peer support providers throughout the state in different places to talk about youth mental health. And today I'm excited to be able to talk to you about advocacy and then about how to craft your story and use it. So I tend to give my presentations in a more interactive way. So I'm hoping you guys, even though it's early in the morning, can be a part of this presentation, because I think how you use your story is so important to your job, of course. That's the reason you're here. And I also think it's so difficult to figure out how to share that story in the right way. So anyways, I'm excited to be here. So I thought we just could start with a little bit of the comments. I want, like Alejandra said, we'll be checking those, but I really would like you to be interactive, and just to get you going, I would like you just to put in the chat something that brought you joy this morning, because I like to focus on those things, and you guys can just read that as we go along and see the snicker of the morning of what brought people joy. So let's get going. Families and Youth of Idaho is our vision is to a world in which children are offered opportunities to experience and realize their full potential. And we do that through our mission, which is we're committed to improving, preserving, and restoring the mental health of youth and families. And the way we do that is at Families and Youth of Idaho, we provide advocacy, support, and education. And I put that youth programs piece because we do this for both families and youth, and so I wanted to make sure I got to talk about that. The advocacy piece, we help families find their voice. We provide opportunities to make an impact, whether that's at the state level or at an individual level and at a community level. We provide support to families. We partner with them to navigate and access resources in the community. And we also provide education to parents, professionals, legislature, medical providers, and most of that information is about yes and living with SED and trauma. My background is specifically working with foster and adoptive families and understanding the impact of trauma when there's early ACEs. So, and just a little bit about our youth programs, because I think they're important for you to know about for families and individuals you work with who have children, or if you're a youth peer support provider. We have a variety of programs throughout the state. We have the Boise Brick House, which is a drop-by space. We have Youth Move, and that's a wellness groups run by peers. It's so informal peer-to-peer support. And that is both on Discord. We have a group in downtown. We have Youth Move Social Support, which is a group of youth who identify as neurodiverse. That would be autism or ADHD, or if they decide they needed that group of social skills to talk about that topic. And we also have a Youth Move at CWI. So let's jump in. Today we are going to talk, I want to make sure that you understand what we're going to do, and that's define what advocacy principles are, and crafting your story, and just talk through some resources that might help you in the future, and talk about what ways you can use your story and just start developing that, because that's a really important job you guys have of using your story to promote wellness. So in the chat box, what do you see what advocacy is? What do you believe advocacy is? So as we begin to talk, we can think through that. And Alejandra, if you would just read some of those answers for me. I know I'm asking you to engage early in the morning, and that might be hard, but.
No, you're all good. Yes, I'm absolutely happy to do that. And I also want to just quickly point out that for those of you that mentioned the audio being a little bit choppy, it's connectivity issues. And so the good thing is that we do use the captions. So if you can follow along the best that you can, doing with what we can within the circumstances. So appreciate that. So answers about what is advocacy: support and helping others work with providers, communicating need, and speaking up for yourself.
Good. Yeah, that's a piece of it, isn't it? And I'm excited to hear just little bits there, because I think you guys have a great idea of the beginning of what is advocacy. So advocacy is public support of a particular cause or policy. So it really, like someone said, needs. I think it's how in the public support is the official way to say it, right? But it's really what helps you have your say in what happens. It's really what is an opportunity, both at an individual level or at a public level, to influence. And you guys get to do that through your story. It helps you have a say in rights. It helps you have a say in needs. I heard that in the chat. And it helps you have a say on things that are important to you. It's really about finding your voice and the spaces to use your voice. And there's so many advocacy places that likely outside of your work, you're already practicing. Because if you're a parent, you advocate for your child's health, the very first doctor visit. You advocate for school and social skills. and opportunities for those. If you're a student or an employee, you're advocating for your work schedule or a work culture. Or on voting day last week, you were advocating for your rights or your desires. And for days at the Capitol or picketing or campaigning, those are all advocacy pieces. And so it's important to think there's lots of different ways, both privately and or individually, I'm sorry, and publicly, that we get to advocate. So what is advocacy in spaces that you guys have advocated as your role of peer support? I talked about individual ways, but what is a way you have seen opportunities to advocate? Someone said providers. I like that. If you could put that in the chat.
I'm going to read those out loud as soon as they come through.
That's fine. I can start talking because as we move on. But if you could just think, like, what is that space? And if we're slow to answer, I think that's reflective of we don't always know that we're advocating for others, and we don't always know that we're how to do that or where to step in that gap. And I think that it's a tricky thing of how to do that, right? Because finding your own voice is a part of advocating for others who don't have a voice and helping give them a voice.
Some great answers that came through is probation for their services of other peer supports, working with those in crisis centers, where you help your peer to talk with others such as landlords and rent, and lots of different scenarios that folks are sharing.
Perfect. Wow, you guys are doing lots of advocacy already and know a lot about this already. Great. So I don't know if you've ever seen the Advocacy Charter. I put that QR code in there because I thought that it might be useful for you to download that. The Advocacy Charter, I thought was just a great, more friendly way to talk about advocacy and think what advocacy is. I recognize you can't see it on the slide, so that's why I gave you the QR code. But as you think about advocacy and principles of advocacy, consider one of those times you just said that you were an advocate, and think about how these played out. And if they pop into your head as they play out, please, if we were in a room, I'd have you raise your hand. So put it in the chat and we'll talk about that afterwards. But so advocacy principles, the Advocacy Charter. You need to have a clarity of purpose, right? You need to understand and be clear and honest about what you can and can't do in that situation. You can help an individual find their voice to go talk to the landlord. You can't set the rent, right? So knowing what you can do is the important part, setting those boundaries. Independence is an important principle. Helping individuals ask for what they need for themselves when they can. There's kind of a, I think of it as a ladder in my background is in development, and I think of a ladder here of advocacy when I work with families, that I come alongside them and I find where they can use their voice and help them to use that more and more. So they might not be able to speak up in a meeting the first time, but if I reflect back what they've said to me and confirm it, it begins to give them a voice. So helping them learn to use their voice and gain that independence. Confidentiality is obviously the privacy when advocating, knowing that as I share my story, that you are respectful of that, and that I've given you the gift of my story, and that you hold that as not someone who shares that to just anyone with identifying information. Advocacy is person-led, so that means that you're helping others ask for what they want and give them choices, and then you are helping them to understand what lead them to that place that they want. I just saw that some people are having trouble hearing me. Is this better, Alejandra?
Yeah, just a bit.
Okay, I don't know quite what's going on. All right, I'll talk louder and see if that helps too. All right, so empowerment, speaking up for, teaching someone to speak up for themselves, that ties in there, right? Equality and diversity. I would add equity on that as well. Fair, respectful, ability to access where they are. And I think that has as much to do with equity as it does equality. So accessible, accountable, check what you do and what you think and have others to come alongside you. And then safeguarding, keeping safe people's story and supporting them. But I think a key piece to be able to do all of that is that you are able to find your own supports. And that's really important as well. All right, so let's look into advocacy principles. Remember I said that it could be at an individual level or it could be at a policy level. Individual level example. A parent has a youth, for me, this is for my job. This isn't speaking to your job, but I'm giving you examples of my own work and advocacy at both individual and policy. Individual is when a family calls me and invites me into one of their meetings, team meetings for their child, and I'm able to come alongside them. That would be an individual level. Even though it's in a group, that's an individual I'm advocating for. Or a policy level would be last year when there was a bill about education of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, to educators. I was able to go speak at the legislature and talk about my own story and the impact of growing up with foster and adoptive children and the impact of early abuse and neglect on individuals, which is adverse childhood experiences. So that's both an individual and a policy level. So we need to think that first. So think about something where you've advocated, if it's individual or policy. It can be in your job or other places, as we learned this example. So you identify the cause. So that's asking about what are the gaps for that of info for the individual. I should say, if it's at an individual level, what are the gaps in information and what that this individual has, or what are the gaps in power to change policy? So we would want to think, okay, this individual going to this meeting at the team might not know all the options of what is offered to a child in Idaho with a mental health diagnosis. So that would be an individual gap. Policy gap would be the knowledge. It was because I worked so closely with early abuse and neglect, the gap in knowledge was almost shocking to me as I spoke to the legislature and about adverse childhood experiences. So identifying that and realizing that before we go into situations really helps us to know how to use our story and craft our story. And then making strategic choices. It's really important to understand, at the individual level, we can ask these what, who, what is the need, and how, those questions. But we also can do that with policy. Finding the objective and the audience and the message and method are all a piece of that. So the what am I advocating for? Who am I advocating for? Really understanding the need, because I keep using that red one because I think that's a great example. But if you're advocating for someone and their rent, with their landlord, there's a million other things behind that that also need advocacy, as you know, right? Like all the things behind that they need help to have financial security. So I think that's important to think, what is the need behind the need, and how can we advocate for those things as well? And then how might we go about that? What is the individual capable of? Or in a policy level, what are we going to do to change something? And then building coalitions as needed. those might be individuals, right? The landlord example, that might be an individual. But let's look at a great example of policy that was changed last year for mental health, youth with mental health diagnosis. There was prior to the last few years, if a parent went to the emergency room with their child who is having a behavioral health crisis, if that parent felt the child was unsafe or their family was unsafe to bring that child home, there would be allegations and charges of abuse, of neglect and abandonment if the parent refused to take that child home when the child needed a higher level of care. Through a group of parents coming together with policymakers, they were able to advocate for changes in law that allows for parents, not allows, that gives parents the opportunity to advocate for their own child and their child's behavioral health needs in the emergency room and not take that child home when they need a higher level of care. And so that's a really big change in policy, that a group of parents came together with policymakers and made those types of changes. So we're going to do a little thinking through your own story, through your own opportunities for advocacy. Sorry, my next slide popped up that I can see and it said story. Through your own opportunities for advocacy. And we're going to think through not a time in the past, but a place, an individual you are working with that you might have an opportunity to advocate for. And hold that individual in your head. It also could be, instead of an individual, also could be policy. So something you know that you're passionate about related to your job that you're passionate enough to want to advocate at a policy level. So think of that cause. We're going to identify that cause. And remember, I'm going to flip back and forth to the slide. At that last slide, we talked about with that cause, we're going to look at gaps in information, and we're going to look at gaps in power and change, and where do we need to change policy. So think about that for a second, and then if you could, I'm trying to make sure we're doing this in an ethical manner, so that's what's my pause. If you could put in the chat like what the topic is that you might advocate for someone that you know, obviously without identifying information.
All right, we have someone that said the food bank, school, refugee medical care. It's a great one. For a child to be involved in activities to their caretaker to help with their mental health, housing, lots of housing, folks who have disabilities, lots of really great examples.
Yeah, that was great. I just saw some of the ones that are coming in. Those are really great. I just noticed this at the top. There were a few questions, maybe. Did I miss those?
I'm sorry, what was that?
There were a few questions. Did I miss those? Maybe it was just people were telling what they were thankful for. I'm going to trust you got them, so no worries.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Good. All right. So hold that in your mind as we think about this. Let's make strategic choices. Think about the what of that, what you want to advocate for. And for that individual, what questions could you ask them to better understand the situation and what they want, right? We're giving voice to the individual, and we want to make sure that we're advocating for what their wants and needs, not what we think is best when we come along for advocating and supporting. So, and with policy for those strategic choices, we're going to think about the objective and audience and message, as I said. And we're going to think about the what and the who and the need. that example of the ER, those parents got together and they knew that they could, the next part is building those coalitions, is build coalitions. They could find parents throughout the state from the stories that our organization was collecting and other organizations were collecting, and they could pull those individuals together and talk about their experiences. Those stories were really powerful. As well, we might not only include individuals, but community members who are working for organizations. For example, our family-run statewide organization would be both a public organization and involve community members that might not have individuals, might not have, the community members might not be impacted directly, but they have seen and heard these things unfold. And then partners. A partner in the legislature was really important on this. An individual alone probably isn't going to be able to make that happen. So anyways, that's really important to think through all those different pieces and think of individuals affected by the community and the community members, and for public policy, you know, how can we pull in other organizations? So and how can you build coalitions, right? If you're working for homelessness and concerned about food security, who might you go to build coalitions and network to meet that individual's needs and bring others alongside on their team, so that it's not you just advocating, but building up a team. So any questions as we talk about that?
Don't see that any questions have come through yet.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So another piece we want to talk about in all this advocacy is that your story matters. I mentioned the ACE's opportunity to talk about the adverse childhood experiences and how those impact individuals. And I had the opportunity to go to the legislature and talk about my own story and why this topic mattered so much to me. So I want to give you my own story just so we can use that throughout this crafting your story for an example. So my sister came from foster care, and I grew up with a lot of other foster siblings as well. But my sister came to us at 11 months old with severe neglect. I was just over 2.5, and so she is really one of my earliest memories of a social worker coming and taking her away and me not understand. Because in my world, my sister had come to me the way the rest of my biological siblings did. She came home in a car, and that's the way they arrived too. They just arrived by parents instead of a social worker. So to me, she was there always, and I don't really remember something different. And she spent her life with the early neglect impacting her whole life. And during our teenage years, her behaviors were extreme. I saw other foster siblings where this wasn't the case, and I didn't understand that. I didn't understand why was her story so different than many of the other kids who came to live with us. But she had come to us at 11 months and had visitation until she was 3, and it wasn't until this was in the 70s, so you could be a foster kid for many, many years. So she wasn't adopted until she was 5. So I went off to college with a question rumbling in the back of my head of wondering how could someone who was removed from a home at 11 months possibly be living out her life so differently than my siblings who were biological. She had such extreme behaviors, and I couldn't understand that. And I went into child development just with that question rumbling along in my head. I went into a field where I worked in a hospital setting to prevent trauma from long-term medical, and I helped with coping and adjustment and development in the hospital. And I came alongside parents to do that. About 2015, well, prior to that actually, probably 2012, I came alongside a group of parents in my church who were fostering and adopting, and it was a large group. And I looked around and went, oh no. I knew that these families were may have, not guaranteed, but may have kids who had extreme behaviors, and that if they didn't understand the impact of trauma, that I wasn't sure what the families would look like, and I wasn't sure what our church community, if they could handle it and be able to provide resources. So I came alongside those parents, and those parents sent me to Texas Christian University to learn about trust-based relational intervention, which is a trauma-responsive developmental intervention to come alongside parents. And I brought that work back to Idaho, and families began to come to the ministry who weren't, the state started sending families who were appropriate for that group, and my business began to grow from that, actually, because originally my friends and those who had adopted did have a lot of big behaviors in their families, and coming to a support group wasn't something they could do at that point. So my business grew, and I began helping families throughout the United States with trauma responsive parenting techniques. Just in the last 4 years, I began to work with families and youth of Idaho, and I get to bring my work and my understanding of trauma into my work daily as I help parents throughout the state and help them understand the impact of trauma and help them live with youth with severe emotional disturbance. So that's my story and how I got here, and we'll use that story to talk about why your story is impactful. You can see that from 2.5, I started really early in how my story impacted my world. And I understand siblings well and parents well of raising a youth that has big challenges. So as you listen to my story, think about ideas. If you could put it in the chat, what makes my story useful? And then let's talk about parts of your story that make your story useful. And you don't need to share your parts. You can talk about my parts right now, since it would be a little awkward. But as you hear that story, what pieces stick out to you of, oh, that could be useful for something? I don't see any answers. Keep thinking. That's fine.
We had a comment come through: overcoming addiction and having a bay and judgment from nurses and doctors. I would advocate by helping this person to have a voice to help them understand. Others said the leaving and coming back, having experience in different areas. I apologize, I woke up with a funky throat. How can I help my own children? I'm the cause of the trauma due to my addiction. Educating others about trauma and advocating for children with severe trauma. So those are just a few that have come in.
Those are great. I love it. I heard a specific question, and since it's my heart's passion, I'm going to speak quickly to the parent, and we'll have a conversation afterwards. But I would say that this is the good thing about parenting, is we get to help our kids being young adults, throughout. And I would say, when I love my mom to come alongside me, even in my young youth, but even in my age, right? Like, we want our parents, and we want that relationship. So your story is not over yet, and this is part of overcoming, right? This is part of it, is your story matters, and your story matters to your kids, and your story will matter to your healing so that you can heal them. So, but let's talk, that person specifically, let's talk, because I'm always excited to help parents. So my school, my work, the thread of trauma throughout my story, I didn't see that piece when I first began working in the hospital setting, that it was trauma leading me, that I was so passionate about. I loved working with kids. And so that was one of the reasons I went into that field. But coming alongside parents, and then, bringing that statewide, getting to bring that work statewide, and then coming to the families and youth of Idaho, it all ties together. And so finding that thread throughout the whole thing is really important. And then, of course, understanding how we can use it. So you could hear that I have a why, that my why is really that my sister becomes my why when I'm talking about foster and adoption. My own parenting journey is my why when I'm working with parents. And I'll be honest, I don't share that part of the journey with many people because I like to be respectful. I can be respectful. This is a good boundary issue. I'm sure I have it later in my slides, so I'm going to be, it's a rabbit trail, but it's important to understand when we're telling our story. I get to tell you my story from my perspective. Even at 2.5, I didn't tell you a lot about my sister and the things that had happened to her, but my sister is not alive anymore, so it's a different boundary than telling my parenting story and my young adult son who lives here and my kids in college and just all the different pieces of what they're going through and how that impacts me. I only get to share my part, and so it's really important to understand that as we understand our why, really what we can share and what we can't share in figuring out that boundary. So, but the why of what brings you to this issue and what gives you passion to invest your time. And for me, it was seeing the impact of trauma on my sister in her first 3 years. And then in turn, now seeing generational trauma in her own kids. And knowing that that can be stopped, and that gives me really, it gives me the fire in my belly in the morning for my work. So secondly, your who. Who is it? We've talked about this multiple times, but who is it that you're talking to? Because your story is different. So I told you the lengthy story. I have a elevator speech that I used to give when I had a business, of a really quick story about the impact of trauma on my sister and how her story impacted me and what my passion is. I also have pieces I tell to a parent and hand my story and entrust the story of trauma and impacting that impact on my sister and how I tell that as different as a parent. And then it was really different when I told it to the legislature. That was for me the hardest. It was the first time I had spoken there, and my voice was cracking. I didn't feel that emotional, but I was so anxious. I sounded like I was ready to cry. So I wish I had practiced in front of a group of people in suits. But understanding who that audience is and what pieces they need to know. The legislature was shocked that something as early as 11 months could impact a child. And so that was really important for them to understand that this early adverse childhood experiences was important. So understanding that audience helps me craft what pieces of the story I'm going to give. And then, of course, not just understanding the audience, but understanding how much do I entrust to them, because I don't entrust everything to every one of my story. And I tell my story differently. I included today intentionally the faith-based piece, but I typically in a public setting don't include that piece. I tell my story differently because I know that for some people that could be offensive, but I wanted to be able to pull that piece out and tell you, I craft my story to my audience. I tell about my sister and the impact it had on me, but I handle that piece really differently depending on the audience and how important that would be to them and understanding my journey. So that's important too, of knowing that you need to craft that differently. And then you're left with the question probably, so you know your why, you know your who, but now the part is your story. How are you going to make your story? So I think the next slide, I don't mean to insult anyone, but I want to help us outline it this way. And my kids would probably laugh because in junior high, I pounded outlining into their head, and it was probably exhausting. So the beginning, you heard my beginning, right? My beginning, I started at 2.5, but I heard someone's story yesterday and they started at 15, right? Like our stories begin for the story we're telling at different places. So maybe you can put in the chat box what are some places where you might begin ages. You don't have to say the piece if you don't want to. You can say piece or age. Let's put it that way. You can choose. That you might begin in your story. So what age were you? I was 2.5 when I started that story. Or what is the more personal pieces? I was 2.5 and I had a foster sibling. So that's an example of how much do you want to share in that. Choose what you share in that chat box. 21, someone said. Thanks. 5, 11. See, we can think of that beginning place, and if you have paper in front of you or your computer open, think of that beginning place and even just write a sentence that is for you, infant. That's where my sister's story would begin, right? As an infant. And this is hard work to think about that. Like, it is hard work for me to think. I mean, I've told this story a million times, so it's much easier for it to flow, but it was and still is, like, there is emotion that comes with standing and thinking about standing on a green shag 70s rug and my sister driving away in an Oldsmobile. Like, there's something to that I still feel it. So I think it's important that we recognize that in our own bodies and recognize that our stories are not easy to tell always, but also excluding those pieces that bring that emotion so that I don't go back there when I tell this story is really important, right? Because I can do that right now behind a screen, but doing that in other situations might be different. I love this answer. It depends on what I am sharing and who I am sharing with. Some things are 9 and some things are 30s. Perfect. So it depends what parts of your story you're sharing and the impact that you want to tell. 13, 19, those are big things that you guys are sharing. And important to realize, like, well, this is a part of me, but look where I am. So we won't go to the where I am yet, the beginning. So we vary that beginning part in the audience and the impact I desire to make. But the middle, your middle is that story. I didn't include from 2 to 52. That would have been a long 50 years for you to listen to, but understanding what parts are highlighted. There are parts of my family I didn't include. There are parts that I don't just entrust to everyone, right? That those are mine. And so figuring out what those middle things are. I think a useful way for crafting your story is to bullet point it. Bullet point ideas, free flow, bullet point the middle, say the beginning and bullet point it. Just little, if you can't go all the way into sentences, just do single words so that you don't dive in too deeply. And then middle, same thing, bullet point it. What are important pieces of your story that you might share with some people? And then have others consider, as you tell that middle part, have others giving you permission. That example of my parenting, I sometimes tell families about my, with my first son, that I was in school, I was finishing my thesis, I had 6 weeks after he was born, I had a publication deadline, I also had moved multiple times during that pregnancy, in addition to a new job, to a new state where I knew no one. The stress keeps going. They were all fabulous things, but the impact of my stress on the infant's brain, and that it developed under cortisol, wired his brain differently. And so I think that I've asked him if I can share that. He knows I use that as an example of the impact that the stress hormone cortisol has on the brain. So I've asked him that, and I wouldn't share how I know that or pieces about who he is, because I don't have that permission, and that's not my parenting story. My story was the part I told you. But I also get to share a little more about my sister who's not alive, and the trauma that had an impact on me, as her trauma was lived out in my home, our home, and then just the impact of those things. So consider bullet pointing it out. What are the things you want to include in your story that are really important? And maybe not every time you share a story, but just highlights of that. And again, I'm just going to say this, like, don't dive into it if it's too much. Just put a word that you can not dive into that experience, but know it's there. trauma when I was 16 is enough, or abuse, or clean and sober 11 years. It's perfect. Like just that much on your bullet point. You know what that means if you decide to craft that out. So, and then of course the end. The end is not written yet though, but right now, where have you come? What are you willing to share about how far you've come in the challenges you face? You know, your roles are really unique as peer support. As I support parents on a family support line, or if I'm doing more, I'm not a clinician, but if I'm doing more clinical-like work, I have different ethical boundaries and different how much I can share to that person, and that takes a lot of work to figure that out. But you guys as peer supports, your story is what is going to help bring healing. I mean, we have evidence of that is so important that you craft this and understand how your story impacts others. But it's important to, what are you willing to share, and how far you've come, and the challenges you're facing now in the future, and what does transformation look like for you? And has that transformation occurred in some areas, and what challenges you face? And finding someone to help you craft that story is so important, because I think it's hard to tell our story without the practice of telling it to safe group and safe people. So, and it's also hard to be able to know, is this a good part to tell, when you may have come, depending who you are, come from a space of not having this types of boundaries. Yes, that's true. I love that comment, that it's very important to meet people where they are and determine if our sharing will ultimately be a trigger or helpful. Thank you for saying that, because that is it. It takes a lot of nuance, doesn't it, to be able to know your story well enough and pull back the pieces that will be too much for someone else, or unintentionally cause harm versus be helpful. And then practice. That's what I always like to say, is practice. Practice your story with others. Practice your story with safe others. And ask if you're able to include others in that storytelling. Remember that it's not about me. When I tell that story to you, I was using that story a lot to get through and show you examples. But when I tell that story, it's not about me. It's like the last person in the comments said, it's about the other person and the impact that story will have on the other person. So I need to listen. I need to be able to include others in my storytelling and ask questions. If this was an audience, I'd ask you questions as I told that story, and I'd be watching your eyes. I'd be watching the way you started wiggling in your chair. I'd be trying to gauge from the audience how my story is impacting you, and then pull back or give more depending on that. And am I telling it to a group, or am I telling it to individuals? Obviously it makes a difference. So that beginning, that middle, that end, and I have to just close with that, like, make sure you practice, right? It's really important to practice that. So if I can figure out again how to stop the sharing, maybe Alejandra can help me with that.
I certainly can.
All right. Anyways, are there any questions? I'm trying to look at the chat box. I want to make sure that as you guys have shared what the different pieces is, I only share pieces so they can realize that they are not alone in what they've gone through. That is so true. Let's see, I don't share until there are moments where I feel the benefit from hearing my story. I only share the pieces that are similar to their story. Yes, that's a great filter of how you choose what you share, so that they can realize they're not alone in what they've gone through. That's great. Super. All right, so any questions about storytelling? I'm done a little bit early, so as interactive as we can make this, I'm happy to do that. I want to go back to my original slide. I'm going to share again in a second. I should have put that at the end. Just one moment. All right. I'm going to share again. All right. I think maybe I'll just put it in the chat. Oh, there you go. I think I'm sharing the wrong. There you go. All right, there's my contact information. I don't have my phone number up there, but that email will work. Good. You guys are making such a difference in the lives of so many people, and peer support is such a fabulous way to fill in gaps and lead the way in what the needs are. And I'm excited that you guys are crafting your stories to make an impact on that. And it sounds like many of you already have that experience of practicing what storytelling looks like. If you have any questions or any pieces that would be helpful to you, or have those questions about trauma and the impact, or if you're a parent and need support, we also run support groups for parents, and so that might be useful as well to look on our website, which is on this slide as well. So I'll wait a moment for the chat, see if there's anything. And Alejandra, do you have anything to share as we close up?
Yeah, I was just going to share again about the CEUs. I know that a lot of folks have questions about the eligibility, and just wanted to share that reminder that all of the information is in the confirmation and reminder emails. I also just want to thank everybody for coming here today and hope that you're able to join us for the other 4 sessions that we have going on today for the conference. I'm not seeing any comments or questions coming through, so I feel good about, ending this a little bit early.
Okay, super. Well, I'm glad to be here today, and again, open to both supporting parents and being a listening ear as people craft their stories. And if they need help doing that in a neutral space, I can be that neutral space and help you with that. So thank you for having me here, and open to questions after this as well. Thank you.
Thank you.